Do not try to save the whole world or do anything grandiose. Instead, create a clearing in the dense forest of your life and wait there patiently until the song that is your life falls into your own cupped hands and you recognize and greet it. Only then will you know how to give yourself to this world so worthy of rescue. This is a poem called Clearing by Martha Postlewaite. And it invites us into this space of welcoming all of ourselves. Every part, the healthy, the unhealthy, the whole, the broken. Of making a clearing in our lives so that we can really receive the totality of this existence. There's a beautiful poem by Rumi that I'm sure many of you are familiar with called The Guest House. And it's actually printed in your bulletin so you can refer to it afterwards. You don't need to look at it now, but just so it's there. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep through your house empty of its furniture, or sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. So in Unity, we don't talk too much about this kind of thing. We want to focus on the good. But what happens then is that when other things come up, being human as we are, other things do come up. And what happens is we spend a lot of energy trying to get rid of those things so we can just be standing in the light. And what happens when we don't welcome those things that are part of us and don't honor them with true loving kindness, we lose our way. We'll often lose our way. So, very interestingly, Jack Kornfield, this wonderful meditation teacher and author, tells of a story. He was with some other meditation teachers, this is maybe 20, 25 years ago, and they were meeting with the Dalai Lama. And he asked a question, or someone asked a question about self-hatred and how they were supposed to deal with self-hatred. And the Dalai Lama stopped him for a moment and turned to his translator and had this kind of back and forth conversation with the Dalai Lama looking very puzzled. Apparently, in the Tibetan language, there is no word for self-hatred. It's a concept they don't have. And so, through his translator, he finally started to come to understand what that was about. And so he asked this gathering of meditation practitioners and teachers who in the audience has to, deals with this problem of self-hatred, and all the hands went up. All the hands went up. So he said, no, this is a problem. This is something we need to do away with. So it has influenced the teachings of Jack Kornfield and Tara Brach a lot. And in fact, Jack Kornfield says he doesn't just talk now about awareness. He always includes the word loving awareness. In the West, we have, are always carrying around this idea that we did something wrong, or we're not good enough, or we have to be better, and that self-hatred sounds very strong, but all of that really is part of that, this kind of constant talk. And you might notice in the next 24 hours, just bring your own awareness to how often you're telling yourself something about, not being good enough or not doing something right, or, some other kind of criticism. So they often talk about, in mindfulness, that there are two wings. The first one is awareness, which is necessary, and just a clear seeing of the present here and now. And the other one is loving kindness and compassion, this loving care from which we will be able to have a wise response. And together, they make mindfulness, which leads to this kind of loving awareness. So Tara Brach says, to begin, we must have the wing of awareness. But to heal, the wing of compassion is absolutely essential. And of course, included in that is self-compassion. So it's very easy for us to have compassion for other people, but we often forget to include ourselves in that practice. So there was a researcher named George Schaller, I believe is the way you pronounce that, a famous gorilla researcher. And, you know, people have been studying gorillas for a very long time, but he had way more success than most. He went in and, you know, sat with the gorillas and observed them. And someone asked him how he was able to acquire so much knowledge about the gorillas, you know, what was different. And he said, I don't carry a gun. So before, the researchers were always, you know, like on alert and worried about what might be happening and, you know, protecting themselves. So he was able to just, you know, set that aside. And so this is a beautiful analogy for ourselves. How often are we carrying a gun around in terms of how we walk with ourselves or how we move into difficult times? You know, are we waiting for some negative thing to come up or some hurtful thought to come up or some whatever, you know, in defensiveness, instead of welcoming all of ourselves and loving all parts of ourselves? So Tara Brach, again, calls this radical acceptance. Radical acceptance. Really being willing to welcome those things in. And there's a story of the Buddha that he was being waited on by his faithful servant Ananda. And you'll see on the front of your bulletins, there's a picture of the Buddha surrounded by Mara. So Mara is this demon god that represents grief and doubt and anger and, you know, all of these, what we term kind of more negative emotions, and he's sitting there placidly in the middle. And so during his time under the Bodhi tree, Mara came and tempted him with all kinds of things, with beautiful, you know, beautiful women who were daughters of Mara, perhaps, they say, with, you know, trying to get him to be angry, all kinds of things, much like Jesus is being tempted by the devil when he went to fast for 40 days and 40 nights. But the Buddha, you know, remained calm, sitting in equanimity. And then he had his awakening, and some thought then Mara would not show up anymore. But Mara kept coming around, and so there's a story of Mara coming to visit the Buddha, and Ananda, you know, sees him coming and is like, oh my gosh, no, I gotta keep, you know, I gotta protect the Buddha from this demon god. And so Mara says, I want to see the Buddha. And he says, oh no, the Buddha's not going to want to see you. The Buddha is busy meditating. And he said, no, tell him Mara is here and he's going to want to see him. So Ananda went to the Buddha, and the Buddha said, oh, yes, Mara, my good friend Mara, tell him to come in. And he welcomes Mara in and gives him an honored seat and offers him some tea and says, Mara, what can I do for you? I see you, Mara. So Ananda was quite surprised by this. But this is the way of the Buddha. Whatever is coming, to welcome it in, just like Rumi was talking about, and say, I see you. And so we can develop this kind of practice ourselves. Perhaps we're feeling some intense grief, and mostly we just want to run away from that, try to be done with that part of our lives. Instead of actually looking at it, welcoming, seeing that grief, and allowing that grief to be. There's another wonderful teacher, Rick Hansen, who says that first you have to let something be before you can let it go. And I think we all spend a lot of time working on letting things go. But perhaps we need to first let it be. And that's that welcoming in. So there's an equation, which I'm sure also some of you are familiar with, that pain plus resistance equals suffering. So the initial pain, something happens. I mean, life does have painful events, or it might be physical pain, but then we start to either try to get rid of it before maybe it's time, before processing, or some other form of resistance. Maybe it's in the form of stories that we're telling ourselves about the pain and what that's going to mean, some event in our lives, and you know, projecting into the future about all the other terrible things that are going to come from this one event. And that's what creates most of the suffering, not the event itself or the initial injury. So the counter equation to that is unpleasantness plus mindfulness equals no suffering. So when we allow this opening, it's like releasing your hand instead of sitting there with this tension of holding something. When we can open our hand and release, we also reduce a lot of that suffering. There might be still some pain, but suffering is different. So there's another story about, this is also from Tara Brach, who she didn't witness this herself, but it was something that she was told by one of the people she was working with. It was a teacher who had started a progressive school and another friend of hers who were in a grocery store. And they saw another mother who had a young child who was getting frustrated with her kid. The kid is pulling stuff off the shelves and, being a little bit unruly, as kids will do. And then the mother got frustrated enough that she started shaking the child. And so this one friend thought the progressive school teacher would be a little bit upset by that and go up to, she started to go up to the woman, and the expectation by the second friend was that she'd kind of admonish her in some way, but instead she said, "Oh, what a cute young boy you have. Your boy reminds me of my own boy. And so bright and intelligent and curious and active." And the mother kind of softened a little bit and let go a little bit and said, "Yes, he's very smart, but sometimes he wears me out." To which the teacher said, "Yes, they can do that." And then as they walked away, the mother kind of took her child lovingly in a much softer manner than she was before. So we can see this example. We know this. When we treat people with kindness, they will then soften too. If she'd been admonished and scolded, she probably would have taken that out on her kid. So it would have just continued on in this cycle. So instead, the kindness rippled out and she became softer. So this is what we can do for ourselves. When we are suffering in some way or hurting in some way, or perhaps we're even just angry, we can, instead of then scolding ourselves, which adds another layer then of negativity, we can say, oh, I'm angry. Oh, hello, anger. Just like Mara was greeted. Hello, anger. Come in, sit down, have a cup of tea. What can I do for you? It's very different, very different. Then things begin to soften. Then we can begin to start to think about, oh, what does this mean? How am I suffering? What's going on and what do I need in this moment? So there's another wonderful story about a vet, or actually I think he was still in the military, a military man who had some anger issues and had some problems in his service because of his anger. So he was required to go to some anger management training, which included mindfulness training, which I guess they have in the military now, which is wonderful, at least in some parts of the military. And so he had been doing this for a little while, and he was at the grocery store in line, and there was a woman in front of him with one item, and he was in a hurry. And this woman had a child with her and started chatting with the cashier, and they're talking back and forth and taking their time and gooing over the baby, and pretty soon the woman hands the baby to the clerk, and the clerk is holding the baby, and, and this man notices his anger is rising. But because he'd had some training, he was able to say, oh, that's my anger. My anger is here, instead of having a knee-jerk reaction as he would have in the past. So he took a deep breath, and eventually they finished and moved on. He was able to, walk up to his place and in the line and say to the woman, what a cute baby that was. And she said, yes, that's actually my own son. My husband was in the service like you in Afghanistan and was killed there. And so I had to go back to work full time. And that was my mother with my child. She tries to come in once a day. I'll start crying. She tries to come in once a day so I can see him. Yeah, amazing. And that all happened because he was able to say, oh, hello, anger, that's my anger. Instead of getting mad at himself, which then would just make him mad at other people. So a really beautiful example. Tara calls this place where we are in this state too often of, I'm not enough, I'm falling short, in some way I'm doing something wrong, the trance of unworthiness. And I'm actually taking a course right now called The Power of Awareness with Tara Brach and Jack Kornfield, and we were asked as homework, to just notice how often we had that kind of thought. I didn't think I thought that very often. It was amazing how often something like that went through my mind, something somewhere. And I lived a long time in Belize, and I was told a lot. It was a very difficult circumstance that I was living under in lots of different ways, and I was very frustrated and sad and other things. And the other women on the island would always tell me, "You'll get used to it." I was like, I don't want to get used to this, And there was also a young woman there. So anyway, there was a lot of tolerance on the island and in that culture, and especially among women, and a lot of tolerance of things that weren't okay. So in my West American mind, I wanted to just change the situation. This should be different, and this, in all kinds of ways. My husband should be different. My house should be different. My life should be different. I want to improve things, right? Progress. And in some ways, there were some things that definitely needed to change. But what I noticed, too, is that there was some wisdom in accepting what is. So there's this balance somewhere between always wanting things to change and accepting everything that is happening right now. So there's a way to open yourself up to what is happening and look at it with wisdom about what really needs to change, instead of just, kind of knee-jerk, everything I'm doing needs to change and everything about this other person needs to change. And I saw that in a really beautiful way. There was a woman who had Down syndrome on the island. And I don't know how old she was, 40, 50 something. She was relatively high functioning. She had a job of a sorts. And I don't think she'd really gone to school or anything like that. But no one talked about her disability. She was just Lolly. She was just Lolly. She was who she was, and this is the way she presented in the world. And she was able to be quite an active member of society because they accepted her for who she was and met her there. So that's the other side of that tolerance. And I see in our culture how much we lack that kind of acceptance for ourselves and for other people, of accepting exactly who we are and how we are, with whatever challenges or shortcomings or whatever word you want to put on that, accepting that. So this morning, this reading was actually not part of what I was planning for today, but you all might know this book, The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. If you don't know it, it's a wealth of wisdom. So I'm rereading it, and I woke up really early this morning and picked it up and found this. This is just where I happened to be. So there's this is a prophet who's come to a town and is getting ready to leave after spending many years there, and lots of different people are coming forward and say, speak to us of marriage, speak to us of child rearing, speak to us of peace, speak to us of these different things. So one of the elders of the city said, "Speak to us of good and evil." And he answered, "Of the good in you I can speak, but not of the evil. For what is evil but good, tortured by its own hunger and thirst? Verily, when good is hungry, it seeks food even in dark caves. And when it thirsts, it drinks even in dead waters. You are good when you are one with yourself. And when you are not one with yourself, you are not evil. For a house divided is not a den of thieves. It is only a divided house. And a ship without a rudder may wander aimlessly among perilous isles, yet sink not to the bottom. You are good when you strive to give of yourself. Yet you are not evil when you seek gain for yourself. For when you strive for gain, you are but a root that clings to the earth and sucks at her breast. Surely the fruit cannot say to the root, 'Be like me, ripe and full and ever giving of your abundance.' For to the fruit giving is a need, and receiving is a need to the root." So we are like this tree. We are the root that has needs, and we are the fruit that is abundant and ripe. And in most of us, those things are happening all the time. Maybe sometimes we are more ripe and full and ready to give, and other times we are more in need or hurting, and then we seek nourishment. But usually there's a mix of those things at the same time happening. And we're very good about rejoicing in those times when we are ripe and full. We're not so good about recognizing that we are just as worthy and just as good when we are in need, and allowing ourselves to be there and accepting and loving those parts of ourselves with all of our hearts. So there's a quote by D.H. Lawrence that says, "Vitally, the human race is dying. It is like a great uprooted tree with its roots in the air. We must plant ourselves again in the universe." So the good news is that we can do that. We can plant ourselves again in the universe and in our lives and in our bodies by this acceptance, by accepting those roots, replanting them in the earth so that they can be nourished. Tara Brach says, as we do that, we discover a more sacred experience of living. So I heard a talk by David Steindl-Rast. He's an Austrian Catholic Benedictine monk. The name of the talk was "Want to be Happy? Be Grateful." And so what he says is that we often think that happiness comes from, that being grateful comes from being happy. That if we have everything we need and everything is going well in our lives, then we're grateful. But he's studied this for quite some time, and in fact, there's people who have very little or whose lives are not going that well or who have a terminal illness who are quite happy, and other people who seem to have everything and everything's going well and they're miserable. So that equation doesn't quite work. So what he's discovered is that actually it's being grateful itself for all of life that brings us into this place of happiness. And he has a beautiful way for us to remember that. He said, all you need to know is what you learned in kindergarten. Stop, look, go. So we stop first, and again, Tara Brach says, all healing begins with stopping. So we stop, so that then we can look around. So if we're crossing the street, right, what we learned in kindergarten, we stop. Then we look to see what's happening there. And when we look, most of the time, our lives are okay, just like right now sitting in this room. We're all able to come here. We had a car that brought us here or somebody else who brought us here. We're breathing. We're not in the hospital. We had probably some breakfast this morning. There's a roof over our head. We have a house to go home to, etc. So when we stop and look, we can see all these things that he says are waiting there for us to rejoice in. But he also recognizes that sometimes difficulty comes in all of our lives. If it hasn't come yet, it will come later. If it's not here now, it's been here before. So in those moments, he says, when we stop and look, we can begin to accept what's happening and ask ourselves how we want to respond to this in a way that is wise and that might benefit ourselves and the world. We can always choose a response that's of some use to ourselves and to the world. But we can't do it if we don't stop, look, and welcome in. So he said, there's always this invitation. The go is the opportunity that's presenting itself. So it might be an opportunity simply to rejoice in what's happening right now, or it might be an opportunity to take action in some other way with our wise response. So I want to close here with a poem called The Unbroken by Roshani Ray. There is a brokenness out of which comes the unbroken, a shatteredness out of which blooms the unshatterable. There is a sorrow beyond all grief which leads to joy, and a fragility out of whose depths emerges strength. There is a hollow space too vast for words, through which we pass with each loss, out of whose darkness we are sanctioned into being. There is a cry deeper than all sound, whose serrated edges cut the heart as we break open to the place inside which is unbreakable and whole, while learning to sing.